It's Easter.
It is. Had a fun Easter. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, along with all of the fun things, there was also a fairly sizable suicide bombing in Pakistan that I heard about just as I was driving in.
Yeah.
And it's prompted a lot of discussions because it falls on the heels of a bombing in Brussels and a bombing in Baghdad, some of which have been attributed to ISIS or ISIL. And the Pakistan bombing, I think the Taliban is taking credit for that.
The latest one, yeah.
Yeah.
The Pakistani one.
And specifically went to a park and were targeting supposedly Christians and Christian families celebrating Easter.
Yeah.
So it's a big, ugly, violent, slaughtering mess everywhere in the world. And it seems to just keep tying to Islam or Islamism in some form or another.
Yeah.
And that's prompted some comments.
We had the Iraq soccer stadium, and then there was the Brussels one that sort of started off the week. And I mean, yeah, it's just been a mess.
And so there's a lot of fear mongering that goes along with this. I know you wanted to talk about some comments in the response to it.
Yeah, some very public commentary that was made. And so, yeah, I saw the interview where Ted Cruz commented about additional police patrols in Muslim neighborhoods to check for radicalization. And that was specifically how it was expressed during the original interview. And I know that they have revised that statement somewhat, clarified it. You know, call it what you want. Either they have, like you said earlier, added more nuance, perhaps, or perhaps backpedaling a little bit, or perhaps, I mean, I don't know what to label it. I just know that the message that came out a few days after the original message was slightly different than the message as it was originally expressed, which was that they wanted police patrols in Muslim neighborhoods to check for radicalization.
Yeah, the slight change, it's almost like somebody didn't really know anything about the topic and said something, and then somebody came in and gave them the Cliff Notes version, so now they're an expert on it.
Yeah, or at least a little more informed. But what I found interesting was that before the clarifications came out, literally that morning I watched the interview. And that was on CNN. And then that afternoon I came home from work, I put on the news, and one of the first things I saw was a local station here in Austin asking our police chief, Art Acevedo, what he would do if he was required to go out and patrol Muslim neighborhoods as described in this interview. And he said that he would be willing to step up the patrols in Muslim neighborhoods, but then he clarified right away and said that he would want to be making sure that the neighborhoods were protected from misguided citizens who thought it was okay to paint a community with a broad brush.
Yeah.
So it was this really concise, you know, spot-on response from Art Acevedo, who I think, you know, every now and then he'll say something that I just want to cheer. And that was one of those moments.
And I think following up, one of my favorite comments, I believe, I'm not sure I'm correct, that it came from the head of the New York City Police Department, who pointed out that he'd like to make Ted Cruz aware that there are over 900 Muslims with guns that he can introduce him to at any point, because they all work for the New York City Police Department. There are over 900 working officers who are Muslim.
Yeah.
But I thought that the way he phrased it was far better than I did. The idea, oh my gosh, there's 900 Muslims with guns and you know where they are, why haven't you done anything? Well, we'd like to give them a raise, actually.
Yeah. Well, it made me think a little bit about, I know that a lot of times people will talk about the differences in their situations based on their communities. Mm-hmm. And so it made me think about my community, you know, like here in Austin, what is the community like, and what is my experience with the Muslim community? What is my experience with terrorism here in Austin? And what is my experience with, you know, that violence on that level? The few things that I could recall were a November 2014 attack where a gentleman went and shot up a courthouse and the Mexican consulate in the early morning hours, just as the nightclubs were opening up, like right before Thanksgiving. So it was a holiday, the nightclubs were you know, ending their nights, people were about to exit and be in the streets, and here was this guy just, you know, packed to the gills with guns, downtown shooting up these buildings, and he had to be taken down. He, if I remember right, his name was Larry McQuinlan, and he was, I believe, shot in the street, so I think he was killed, and we don't really know what his motivation was, but he appeared to target government buildings. And we had a very similar thing here as well, where in February 2010, we had an actual suicide pilot who flew a plane into a building, which was literally on my commute home.
It was across the street from where I was working at the time.
I mean, this was wild that he flew this plane into a building. His name was Andrew Joseph Stack III, and he had a beef again with the government. He had an issue with the IRS and decided to fly his plane into the building. Took out himself and an Army veteran, a retired Army veteran, who was working at the government offices. And then the only sort of problem that I could recall with anything to do with Islam or a mosque here in the Austin area was when someone vandalized a Pflugerville mosque. Yep. I was like, this is the violent episode that I remember with Islam in my community was some idiot vandalized a mosque and was never caught. Smeared feces all over the facade, tore up a Quran, put it on the front of the building. I mean, none of these acts are acceptable. And they're not acceptable for any reason. There was no justification for what any of these people did. And I'm sure that in their minds they felt it was justified or they wouldn't have done it, but it wasn't. So it made me think about when I was a Christian, because the Christianity I was raised in, I remember having conversations with you where you would talk about things like Elijah and the bear, and you would say, we never read this at church. Like, we skipped all these horrendous stories. And I was like, oh no, where I went to church, we read them, and they told us about how God was totally justified killing children. If they were mocking a prophet, they deserved to be torn apart by a bear.
Yes.
So my brand of Christianity was like a lot more intense, I think, than some other people's, and we were pretty much taught to obey, and that whatever God did was okay, and we just didn't understand it. If that was, I think, my woo.
That was the God smiling down on you.
Sound. Anyway, I thought about how different people that I'd met who were Christians sort of interpreted that the authority of God, or the authority of the Bible, or the authority of their religious doctrines, and how that integrated with their own conscience, their own ideas. And there were a handful of different ways that I observed people dealing with how to treat other people and what was the right way to act based on what they were being told by a particular religious set of rules and what they themselves were able to ingest and take away from that. One of the things was that some people judged what was right based on their own moral compass, and if the religious doctrines didn't align, they just left the religion. So they would say, this is garbage, this cannot be right, this is teaching something wrong, and they would just abandon the religion. Some people left the church because they couldn't agree with what was being said. But then there were other people that judged what was right based on their own moral compass, and then they would conform the religious teaching to fit their own moral code. So they would say, I want this to be okay, and it doesn't sound like the Bible is saying that this is okay, and so I need to find a way to make the doctrines fit my beliefs, and I will find a way to integrate both so that I can proceed with what I feel is correct, or what I perceive to be correct for whatever reasons, and then I am just going to say that this religious doctrine does in fact support that. So they would sort of drag the doctrine along in whatever way was required in order to support what they already, for whatever reason, felt was justified as right action. And then when that would be if, unfortunately, that was whether their intentions toward other people were good or not, right? So this is why you had situations where during abolition, people that owned slaves and people that were abolitionists who both were arguing that the Bible supported what they believed. It wasn't, a lot of the people that were that owned slaves during that time had a lot of reason to want to own them. I mean, it was beneficial to them as the owners to be able to continue this practice. It wasn't just a matter of doing what they felt the Bible allowed. It was about the idea of, this benefits me and I don't want to give it up and I'm going to proceed with this, and I think the Bible also supports it. And in the meantime, you had other people who said this is completely wrong and this is not okay to do to other people, and I think the Bible supports this, right? So you just had these people kind of going head to head with what they thought was okay. Some of them didn't really have a problem or felt like it was all right to own slaves, and some of them felt like this was completely wrong, but they both just sort of went head to head and then dragged their doctrines along to say, you know, this supports what I want to do.
Right.
And then you had people that judge what's right based on their own moral compass, but then they would disregard that if the religious teachings didn't align. So I actually saw situations where people were willing to support something harmful if they were convinced the doctrine required it, even if they couldn't justify it. And in some cases, those people felt wrong doing the thing they were supposed to do, but they didn't trust their own judgment enough to say, I'm not going to do this. They literally felt like, if this is what God wants me to do, if this is what the Bible is telling me to do, and I don't feel like it's the right thing to do, I need to trust God. And so they would proceed basically saying the authority is morally correct, and if I don't understand it and I feel bad about it, I just need to trust that the authority is correct and that I don't understand it, and that's why I'm feeling bad. And so they literally would just go with what they were told to do, even though they felt it wasn't correct. It wasn't that they felt okay with it, it was that they felt like not being okay with it was a problem with them, right, and not the authority.
You don't know what God knows.
Right, so you can't judge, and so you just need to trust and go with it. Excuse me. And then there were other people that I saw that didn't even seem to have a moral compass. They didn't make any sort of moral judgment or use morality in any way. They just simply followed a religious doctrine, and as they understood it, regardless of what was required. And these were people that I can only describe at best as being amoral, and then they were ready to harm or help. They didn't exercise any responsibility toward their actions beyond what they perceived to be a responsibility to blindly obey whatever the religion required. God said it, and I'm required to do it, and that's how I take responsibility. I'm taking responsibility for what I'm required to do by God, not what I feel like I should do or what I can justify.
Far more robotic in the slave for Christ.
It's like the bumper sticker that says, you know, God, something like God said it, I believe it, that's it.
And actually, that got modified to God said it, that's it.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter whether you believe it according to them.
Yeah, you just do it.
It's funny because we get to this thing where, you're probably getting ready to get to this,
no, that's okay,
where there's essentially a no true Scotsman issue here going on. How do you determine what is or isn't, for example, in this case that we're talking about, Christianity? Mm-hmm. And is it based on what the Holy Book says that they all point to? Do you base it on what the religious governing bodies say? The Pope or the head of any particular collection, like the Southern Baptist Convention? Do you base it on what any individual denomination or church does? Is it left up to the individuals? Is it about the majority? You know, what counts as Christianity in this sense? And the real answer, as far as I can tell, is we really don't know. I mean, if you say that what you're doing and you're a Christian and you try to tie it back to your doctrine, the only thing we can really do, as far as I'm concerned, is go back to the book that you're citing, because I have no access to your personal revelation.
Right.
So I can go back to the book you're citing and say, yeah, what you're advocating is in your book, and it seems to be the way you're viewing it. Or I don't find that in your book, and you seem to be adding something to it. Where's the justification for that? I'll let you keep going on your thing.
No, that's fine.
Because I'm going to flip this in a minute to talk about Islam, so I want to make sure we...
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back and just say that, you know, still in keeping with my own experience of here in Austin, and the communities here in Austin, when I visited the mosque here in Austin, they had an open house, like an ongoing open house with information sessions on, you know, like an Islam 101, and you can do an all-day course on Saturday, or you can go in different nights of the week and take different courses. But I was treated very hospitably by people who seemed decent and non-threatening, and I listened to them explain their religious views and their perspectives on life, and I saw some areas where we agreed, and there were other areas where we had some really deep ideological differences where I really did not agree. Now
the conspiracy theorists would just say that of course they have to treat you nice, because that's the way they buffalo you.
Nobody I met that day, guests or members of the mosque, made me feel anything but welcome, and my companions and I felt completely okay asking questions, and we did. We asked what I felt were some tough questions. And the imam, to his credit, did his best to respond honestly. There were a few times when he admitted that the questions were difficult ones for him to answer, where he had to stop and think, or where I would have a part B. He would answer something and I would say, well, that's not really what I'm asking, and then I would put the rest of the question, and he really would take some time and sit and think, and he would say, you know, I have to think about this from a perspective of what if someone came to me with this problem, what if they were asking me for counseling, here's what I would hope I would say to them. And
I don't know about anybody else, but I'd pay real money to watch Tracie sit down with a Muslim imam and have these conversations.
Well, sometimes he was just explaining doctrines.
Right.
Like somebody would say, what does, you know, Islam say about this? Or what is the idea, you know, how do you handle this or that? And they would just explain, like, this is how this is usually handled from a doctrinal perspective. But then there were other times where you really saw him digging deep and having to consider how he felt and how his ideology played into his perspectives about how people should be treated.
Right.
Because there were some conflicts in, you know, in some of the presentation of, you know, this is how I think people should be treated, and then how people would be treated in certain situations. And so I was asking, how do you, you know, how do you reconcile these things?
There was a panel discussion that I think it was at Reason Fest in Kansas that JT and some others took part with, and they had a Muslim on the panel, and I think that he was probably treated worse than he deserved based on you know, his willingness to come there and try to defend this. But he also said some things that were laughable in the face of what we already know about the general Islamic view of respect for women. And clearly you're using that word in a way that doesn't match what the rest of us are using.
That would be one of my deep ideological differences.
Yes. It's like, you know, it reminds me very much of when I hear people talk about God's love, and it doesn't matter whether it's coming from Islam or Christianity, God's love. He has a very different usage of that word than what I would be accustomed to. And the same thing with respect for women, which was in scare quotes for the people who are listening on audio.
Yeah. But when I started thinking about this, and I started thinking about my past experience with what people would justify, like within my own church, and how, you know, these were things that you were just like, well, in our church, they just skipped this stuff. They didn't even address it. And I'm like, wow, in my church, they said, this is okay.
It was either skipped or glossed over.
Yeah.
It was kind of a. I have this great book that I bought. It's an antique. I probably have to bring it in sometime, and it is Bible stories specifically written for kids. And it's not like a cartoony book. It's written at like a first grade level, and it's really manipulative. I mean, talking about Abraham and Isaac, they actually change it so that they start with God asking Abraham to bring Isaac. And then they gradually replace the word God with love in all caps. So love asked Abraham to give up his son Isaac.
That's creepy.
And there's all kind.
That's creepy.
I'm going to do a whole series of videos on the stories in that. Yeah.
Like murder his son.
Give him up to love.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. But when I started to think about this, I realized that for me, it's less important what the label is that's on somebody than how they determine the best way to treat other people. So no matter what label someone wears, the option to take responsibility for their own actions and to make judgments is available to that person. I mean, people do it even when they're under authoritarian regimes where they say, you know, the Bible is saying one thing, but I don't think that's right, so I'm going to change that a little bit to sort of suit what I wish was right, because I don't believe God would say that. God would not do something that bad. And whether I agree with the way they justify it or not, if ultimately they come to the conclusion that, you know, you have to treat people well, and if the Bible is not describing that, I'm going to make it do whatever it needs to do to make it describe that, because I need to treat people well, and I'm not going to not treat people well.
You are better than your God. You're better than your holy book.
You have that option to take responsibility for your own actions and make judgments. It's available to you even when you are participating in what is normally considered to be an authoritarian system. And in the end, we do what we do for reasons that we consider as justification, and we, each of us, as individuals, have to answer to one another, because society is going to bear the consequences of what we as individuals choose to do as members of a greater collective. So it doesn't matter to me what the Bible or the Quran told someone to do. It matters to me what they ultimately did, and whether they actually manifested or concern for other human beings when they did it. And that's kind of where I land on this.
Yeah. And we're going to get to callers in just a minute, but I'm going to kind of take what you were talking about and spin it off so that we're specifically, in many cases, addressing Islam. And that's because this comes up all the time, and we're in a week where there have been a number of different bombings that a number of different Islamic groups have taken credit for.
Yeah, top of
and
ISIS.
there are a bunch of people who don't include any nuance or attempt at accuracy, and there are some people who go way too far in applying nuance, and a lot of these people are at odds. I mean, in some cases, for example, Tracie and I don't agree on everything. Sorry. So we're on the same show. So aren't we a hive mind? Isn't it my job to keep Tracie in line? Isn't it her job to keep me in line? Don't both of our reputations depend on whether or not, what some random jackass thinks about somebody else? So don't saddle Tracie with what I've said. Don't saddle me with what Tracie said. Don't saddle any of us with what Russell has said or Don has said or whatever. You can... The fact that we're all on the Atheist Experience doesn't mean we're a homogenous collective. Similarly, when you look at Christianity, there's the Bible. There's some versions of the Bible that have extra books, Catholics, and then Mormons have added a whole other thing on there. There's a lot of different denominations. There are different views about all of this. And so you have Christianity, and then you have different denominations of Christians that disagree on various things. Well, there's a distinction between Islam, the religion, and Islamism, which is sort of the political wing that ties itself to Islam, that wants to impose Sharia law on everybody in the world, basically, is the short version of Islamism. Now, I object to both of them. One far more strongly than the other. I object to Islam because it hasn't met its burden of proof, and I find that the teachings within the Quran to be immoral, offensive, obscene, in the same way that I find offensive and immoral and obscene teachings in the Bible. It hasn't met its burden of proof, it's irrational, and it seems to be doing a lot to encourage groups of people to act in certain ways. But, like I was saying before, how do we tell what is the true Christianity or the true Islam? Is it the Holy Book, the Quran, the Bible? Well, I don't know. Is it what a particular imam is teaching, a particular school, a particular denomination? Is it about, do Sunnis have it right? Do Shias have it right? There are a number of different implementations of Sharia law as well, depending on which school they're coming from. So I do make a distinction between Islam and Islamism, in the same way that I make a distinction between, for example, Christianity and Christian dominionism, which is basically analogous to Islamism. Christian dominionists want to have God and their particular version of Christianity in charge of everything. That's their goal. The big difference is that Christian dominionists in the United States don't really have a power base with which to operate. They don't, have a standing army and massive funds and support. They tried to do a mass exodus to South Carolina, and I was like, I really like South Carolina, but I think I might give that up if we could get all those dominionists in one area. I think I might. But we also have a constitution that protects religious liberty and the freedom of expression and other things. And the system that we have here helps keep extremist groups in check a little bit. What you have outside of the United States and other places are systems that don't necessarily do that. And you have systems that are theocracies, where Islamists have taken over with their particular group. And you have to remember, you hear about the Taliban all the time. The Taliban takes responsible for these bombings today. The Taliban's only existed probably for less time than Ice Baby has existed. This is a particular group that came about in the early 90s, and it's kind of a throwback to the more literal, more dogmatic views within Islam. And so I don't want to paint every Muslim with the same broad brush. That's the kind of idiocy that we see from candidates who want to patrol people based on their religion, who are fearful that because someone associates with a religion that they are therefore likely to be a threat, or likely to be a bigger threat than somebody else. And Islam may be the most dangerous religion in the world worldwide. But that doesn't mean, as Tracie was pointing out, that it's the most dangerous religion here in Austin.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it's the most dangerous religion in the United States, or pick some other country. There are going to be different problems in different areas. So I found myself actually agreeing with a politician who I despise about the Islam and Islamism thing. So how do we tell? Well, one of the things that defines a religion to outsiders is what they perceive as the majority. And when you have a political wing to your religion that is well armed, that has massive amounts of control in certain countries' governments, that is also actively seeking control in other countries' governments, that is waging a war on dissidents from within its own religion, the different varieties of Islam. You know, the Taliban is going after ISIL, and these people are going after other, Shia Muslims, etc. You have all of this conflict going on. There's a power base there that becomes, whether it's accurate or not, the de facto perception of your religion. Now, it's easy to say, this is your damn religion, go clean it up yourselves. That's easy to say, but when a terrible regime advocating the most literal, the most dogmatic, the most oppressive to civil rights version of a religion is the one with the power, it's very difficult for the peace-loving people who disagree with those aspects of their religion to actually rise up and do something about it. And those are the cases where you might need support from outsiders. So I don't go the full-on, let's throw so much nuance in there that Islam is a religion of peace. Bullshit. There are good people, there are bad people in all religions and outside of religions. And there are religions that advocate for all kinds of horrific things. I saw a study that shows that the Bible actually advocates for more violence than the Quran. There's various little complaints and nuances about that. The point is, they all advocate for terrible things. The difference is that Christianity isn't currently in a position in most places where it can do the worst things from a position of power. And Islam is. The Islamists are in positions of power around the world where they can and do take actions that violate the civil rights of individuals, the human rights of individuals, and kill people at a much greater rate than we see from just an abortion clinic bomber or even the KKK, which might be the extremist wing of the Christian religion. They identify as Christian, they want to make appeals to their particular interpretation of what God wants from their understanding of the Bible, and generally speaking, other Christians shut them down. Not always, but generally speaking, I think the KKK has about maybe 3,000 members at last. Last statistic I saw. They're a joke. They are an embarrassment, and they're not a grand threat, even with their grand dragon and grand poobah. That's not the same for Islam, for Islamists who are trying to implement Sharia law. The only nuanced distinction that I make and continue to make is to make sure that we're not painting with a brush that is so broad that we violate people's religious freedoms, and that we say, you are associated with this religion, which is generally frickin' terrible, and therefore you are probably terrible too. Because that doesn't follow. It's actually a fallacy to make that. You might say, well, more likely to be. But these new regimes are fairly new, and they are, despite having a good power base, moderately small. But because of the position they hold, they end up defining what Islam is, even to the peaceful people who have to live under that regime. They don't have the power base to rise up, and that's why I support going after Islamism with everything that we've got in order to empower people to change the regimes, to take back their religion, to end. When I say take back the religion, I'm not saying that the peace-loving people have the right version of the religion. I'm saying I'd rather their version become the more popular one. And then we can get back to pointing out how they still don't have any good reason to believe this, how it still advocates for terrible things even though they're not following it. And we can point out that they've been dragged out of the Dark Ages and are now cherry-picking their religion the same way Christians did, and good for them, and why don't we chuck all that shit out? But that's all I had to say about,
yeah.
about Islam.